The chapter over circulation and gas exchange can be is actually a whole lot of information, and we might end up breaking up this presentation into two different um, separate presentations so that it moves a little bit more freely for you. But it seems like it's a whole lot of information. A lot of it is a little bit redundant, and hopefully a lot of it is a little bit common sense to you as you're kind of starting to get to the point where you're understanding a little bit more about how form fits function, and hopefully it kind of digests a little bit easier into your brain, and kind of makes the way that things work here with the gas exchange kind of starts to make sense for you. So just a little overview. Um, Anything that animal cells do, they require certain things like oxygen, especially, and nutrients. And that is accomplished by crossing over the plasma membrane. So oxygen is moving from our blood cells um, into muscle cells, tissue, and things like that. In unicellular organisms, exchange occurs directly with the environment. So if you were one big one-celled blob, you would just get direct, it would be basically osmosis or diffusion. But since most things are multicellular organisms, we have to have more specialized systems that can carry out this gas exchange. So one example would be gills. They're specialized exchange, specialized things that allow for exchange of oxygen. So oxygen diffuses from the water into the blood vessels, and then CO2 diffuses from the blood out back into the water, causing the bubbles that you see when you see fish breathing or a turtle down there or something like that. So internal transport and gas exchange are functionally related in most animals, and we'll see this in humans and mammals as well, how it's all inside. So you know that we breathe in oxygen, O2, right? And then our waste when we breathe out is CO2. And so CO2 is what plants bring in. Hopefully you recall this from biology 1406 with photosynthesis. Our waste products are what they need to survive, and vice versa. Their waste product, oxygen, is what we need to bring in. Well, we have to have a way to get oxygen to things that need oxygen and CO2 out so that it doesn't build up and cause basically poisonous on the inside. And so the movement of oxygen and CO2 between cells is through something called diffusion. And you hopefully remember that also from 1406. And another thing you should remember about that is diffusion is really only efficient over really small distances. So we have other things that allow us to move oxygen throughout our body, because our bodies are really actually very large when you look at how small a molecule of oxygen is, and things that are able to move the CO2 out to our lungs so that we can exhale it out and get it out of our body. So in order to move those things around, we use usually the surrounding medium, so the plasma, the interstitial fluid that we have. We have this fluid that's around in our body that isn't necessarily blood, because you know your blood is going through capillaries and veins, so it's really contained. But we have to have something else that allows that to move. So in some animals, this very, very simple animals like this flatworm, the central gastrovascular cavity functions to distribute those substances throughout the body. So they don't actually have like a certain circulatory system or a respiratory system. So I would know the difference between open and closed circulatory systems. If you're a more advanced animal, a circulatory system has circulatory fluid. For us, it's blood. It has a set of interconnecting vessels and a pump that moves that blood around. And your system can either be open or it can be closed. Open is a little bit more ancestral, and closed is more adapted, younger, more evolutionarily, there's more of an advantage to it. Insects and other arthropods and mollusks have open circulatory systems, so they don't really have lungs like we do, and they don't have vessels that move things around. Instead, it just kind of floats around like a waterbed almost, right? And their circulatory system is something called hemolymph. So it's in our body, our hemoglobin, our blood, is separate from our lymphatic system. It's two separate systems, two separate vessels that move those things around. But in a insect, and other arthropods like millipedes and centipedes and spiders, it's called hemolymph. It's all mixed together. And so in the case of this grasshopper, an open circulatory system is basically, they do have a heart down here. So if you remember from like A Bug's Life or something, they say cross my heart and he crosses over his abdomen. Well, the abdomen does contain the majority of the heart. It's got the pumping system down here. And it's very similar to like a balloon that a clown would blow up. So blood gets pumped into these little holes here, and then just like that balloon, if you squeezed it, it would cause pressure that pushes the blood this way towards its brain, but it would come out the end, circulate back around again, get pumped back through these holes. And so it's an open circulatory system. It still has a pump and it still has a rotation, but there aren't any like specific veins that are going to carry that around like we have in our body. So a closed circulatory system is where the circulatory fluid is confined in vessels. We have veins, we have arteries, we have capillaries. And these systems are found in more advanced animals like annelids, cephalopods, and all of us vertebrates. One or more hearts pump blood through the vessels. So we have one heart made up of many different chambers, but some other animals might have multiple hearts or separate hearts. And chemical exchange occurs between blood and the interstitial fluid and between the interstitial fluid and body cells. So we breathe in oxygen, it goes into our lungs, our blood picks it up and takes it to the muscles, and the muscles then use it from there. So it's constantly moving around. And so like with an earthworm, it's a closed circulatory system, meaning that everything, and this is a very simple closed circulatory system, but everything is confined within veins or within vessels. Humans and other vertebrates have that closed circulatory system. We call it a cardiovascular system. And there are three main types of blood vessels to be aware of. There's arteries, veins, and capillaries. Blood flow is always one way in these vessels. So it doesn't, if it's headed to the heart, it will never backtrack where it should not. When it does, that means something bad is happening. It shouldn't fall back away from the heart. It always is unidirectional, one way. So it has, all these vessels have specific jobs. Arteries will branch off into smaller arteries called arterioles, and the arteries always carry blood away from the heart. So that's kind of easy to remember. Arteries away from the heart and to capillaries. And capillaries are usually in these little beds, these capillary beds or these little networks or webs, and that's where chemical exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid will take place. And so when you have like burst capillaries, right, you have these little beds that when you have some sort of trauma to the capillaries, it causes a bruise or like a blood blister underneath the skin. So arteries away from the heart to capillaries, these capillary beds are found where exchange occurs, gives something good, but then these venules are also touching these capillary beds, which will converge and become something larger like veins and return the blood from the capillaries to the heart. So arteries away, veins are two. And they all meet at the capillary beds, right? Arteries and veins are distinguished by the direction of blood flow. Arteries are away, veins are to, but not by the oxygen content that they have. So that's kind of a common misconception that we always had when we were kids, right? Oh, you can see the veins or the arteries in your skin because it's blue because it contains oxygen, or it doesn't contain oxygen. And really it's just the pigment of it has nothing to do with oxygen content really. It's more the pigment of your skin changing the color underneath. So arteries away, veins are two. Vertebrate heart contains two or more chambers, and so blood enters to the heart through the atria and it pumps out through the ventricles. Bony fish, the cartilaginous fish like rays and sharks all have a single circulation with a two-chamber heart. And what that means is that blood leaves the heart, it passes through two capillary beds, and then it comes back to the heart. So here's our heart here in the middle. artery is away from the heart, right? So it's leaving the heart, it goes to these capillary beds, picks up oxygen. There's gas exchange where it dumps out oxygen somewhere, like to the muscle, and then the veins come back into the heart. And remember how we said it doesn't matter how much oxygen is in a vein or an artery. That's not what distinguishes them. It's the direction of the flow to or away. And so you can see in this part, it's all oxygen poor coming to and leaving the heart here. Amphibians, reptiles, and mammals have double circulation. So we have this double circulation where oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood is pumped separately from the right and the left sides of the heart. So having two different pumps within the heart kind of actually simplifies the coordination of pumping within. It seems more complex, but it actually is more simplified in how it works. So your heart is in the very center right there. Right? And you have arteries pumping away from the heart, but you have oxygen poor and oxygen rich pumping away, and then veins coming back in, oxygen poor and oxygen rich over here. Same thing here, I guess that was with a frog, and this is with a mammal. So the right side of the heart delivers oxygen poor blood, and the left side of the heart propels the oxygen-rich blood to the capillary beds. Right side is poor, left side is rich with oxygen. The oxygen-poor blood returns to the heart and it completes the systemic circuit. So double circulation means that you have two sets of veins coming in and two sets of arteries leaving, right? One side is poor and one side is rich with oxygen. And that double circulation maintains higher blood pressure in the organs than does single circulation. So if you were to measure the blood pressure in an amphibian, it'd be much, much lower than it is in a mammal. Some vertebrates with double circulation are these things called intermittent breathers, and they're adapted so that the circulatory system temporarily bypasses the lungs. So frogs and other amphibians actually have a three-chambered heart, 2 atria and 1 ventricle. And the ventricle pumps blood into a forked artery that splits. And so basically when they're underwater, blood flow to the lungs gets shut off. So they're intermittent. And it's just basically to save them. It's mainly aquatic animals that would have this intermittent breathing. Turtle, snakes, and lizards have 3-chambered heart. I would just kind of understand the difference between how different animals' hearts are put together. And by understanding that, it kind of helps you understand how humans are very efficient and also how even these animals are extremely efficient for the niche that they live in. So mammals and birds have 4-chambered hearts with 2 atria and 2 ventricles. The other guys had 3 chambers, right? The left side receives and pumps out only the oxygen-rich blood, and the right side is always the oxygen-poor blood. There's no mechanism to vary relative blood flow to the lungs or the body, so we don't have the intermittent breathing. But also what's similar between mammals and birds is that we're endotherms. And so we require more oxygen than the ectotherms do, which is why we are adapted to have this 4-chambered heart, and we're a little bit more efficient. Birds especially are extremely efficient. So the reason why we even have this cardiovascular system is that we are in constant need for oxygen, and having the cardiovascular system is what fulfills that requirement. So we've said this a couple times, which means that the flow of the blood is probably pretty important for y'all to understand and know and be able to recall for an exam or a quiz. Blood flow begins with the right ventricle, and it pumps blood to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. The blood loads up with oxygen at the lungs and unloads CO2 in this little capillary bed. And so then from the lungs that's rich with oxygen, it's going to enter the heart at the left atrium, because only the left side receives and gets rid of oxygen-rich blood. And then it gets pumped through the aorta into the blood tissues, giving off all of that oxygen, picking up all that CO2 that we don't need and taking it back to the heart. The aorta provides blood through the heart through the coronary arteries, and then oxygen and CO2 take place. The transfer of the two take place in the capillary beds. Blood returns to the heart through the superior vena cava. So let's watch the flow.
In mammals, blood pumped by the right side of the heart passes through the lungs and enters the left side of the heart. This is the pulmonary circuit. Blood pumped by the left side of the heart is distributed to the other body organs and returns to the right side of the heart. This is the systemic circuit. This pattern, called double circulation, ensures vigorous blood flow to the organs because the heart pumps the blood a second time after it returns from the lungs.
So this figure is a pretty good figure that kind of takes you step by step where you should be seeing the blood flow. So if we start at 1, we're in the left side, I guess it's oxygen poor. I guess it looks like it's the left side, but it's really the right side, right? Because imagine it on your in your actual body. So out, oxygen poor, to the lungs to pick up oxygen, back in, right? Out to give it to what things need to give to get the oxygen, and then back in on the left side. I'm sorry, the right side oxygen poor, and then it just kind of circulates and circulates, right? So I would look through that, watch those videos. They're really helpful as many times as you can until it makes a lot of sense to you about how the heart is working. So the other important thing about the heart to know is that it's a muscle, right? And it contracts and it relaxes in a rhythmic cycle, and that's what allows the blood to pump. And when that muscle is not working the way that it should, then our blood isn't pumping properly. And so when you go under cardiac arrest and your blood in your heart stops, the muscle is no longer pumping, and so a shock should get that rhythm started again, and that's the point of that. One complete sequence of pumping is called a cardiac cycle. The contraction phase of the cycle is called the systole. So when the heart squeezes, it's the systole cycle, and when it relaxes, it's the diastole cycle. Cardiac output depends on both the heart rate and the stroke volume. So it's determined by your heart rate, your beats per minute. And the volume of the stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by a ventricle in one contraction. So we have these valves to prevent backflow into the heart. And you hear about this all the time when someone has a defective valve, it's not working. Or you're born with a valve that's too small. And so what happens is you get backflow of blood into the heart, and either your blood pressure is then too low because nothing can pump out properly, or you get can maybe get mixed up a little bit with oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood. So we have the AV valves, which separate the atrium and the ventricle. Atrioventricular valves separate the atrium and the ventricle, right? That makes sense. And the semilunar valves, which control the blood flow to the aorta and the pulmonary artery. The sound that the heartbeat makes is the recoil of the blood against those valves, and so they call it a lub dub. And when the doctor checks your heart with the stethoscope, they're listening for that to determine that your valves are acting properly. And then when you get backflow, when you get a defective valve, that causes a heart murmur, so it makes a noise that isn't the ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom that we should be hearing. Some cardiac muscle cells are autorhythmic, meaning that they contract without any signal from the nervous system. So the SA node, the sinoatrial node, is our pacemaker, and it sets the rate and timing at which all other cardiac muscle cells contract. So when that's not working properly, then you get a fake pacemaker that when it doesn't act right, it shocks it and makes it act correctly so that your heart does work properly. That sinoatrial node produces electrical impulses that spread rapidly to the heart and can be recorded as an electrocardiogram. So when you go and you get an EKG or an ECG, they are checking to see how your valves are working properly, how your heart is working properly. And there you can, the ECG is measuring many different things based on where the signal and where the contraction and the relaxation is happening. Impulses from the SA node travel to the atrioventricular node, the AV node, and then that causes the ventricles to contract. Okay, so fluid transported by an open circulatory system comes into direct contact with all cells and has the same composition as the interstitial fluid. But in our body, our closed circulatory system, it's much more specialized. So blood is actually considered a connective tissue, and it consists of many different types of cells that we'll talk about, but it's sitting in this liquid matrix, or this thing that allows it to move around. And the matrix is the plasma. So there's plasma, within the plasma are the cells. The way that they move and the way that they stick together is through this plasma. Cellular elements occupy about 45% of the volume of blood. So the plasma makes up more than half of what the blood actually is. So you've heard about that, right? You can give plasma, or you can give red blood cells, or they can test you for your white blood cells. You can also get white blood cells. Your blood is not just one thing. It's not red blood cells. It's made up of many, many, many different things. And this is just a video showing how the blood cells, the individual cells, are rolling through there. It's pretty fast and kind of amazing. So this is a good figure to maybe hit pause and do a little bit of reading on, but as opposed to reading it actually to you, I think it'd be a better idea for you to check it out yourself. But basically, plasma has a lot of different things in it and a lot of different functions, as well as our blood cells do. So among the many things that are in the plasma, we have salts, we have dissolved ions, we have electrolytes, right? And some of these buffer or maintain the osmotic balance of the blood, so make it so that it's not too salty, or there's not too much water, or whatever the case may be. Plasma protein influences the blood pH, the osmotic pressure, and viscosity. So plasma is pretty important. I would know its functions and why it's there and what it does. Certain plasma proteins also will allow for some fat transport, also immunity, and quite a bit of blood clotting. So I would know that we have two different classes of blood cells. There are red blood cells, which are meant to transport oxygen, and then there's white blood cells, leukocytes, which function in defense. Red blood cells are erythrocytes, leukocytes are white blood cells, and white blood cells are when you have a high number of white blood cells. That usually means that something's not right in your body, right? Because they're making more of it of themselves so that they can do something to defend you. Leukemia is when you have way too many white blood cells. Platelets are a third cellular element, and they're just kind of pieces of cells, and they help with clotting. So if we don't have enough platelets, you might be a hemophiliac, and you cannot clot when you cut yourself, and so you bleed and bleed because your platelets aren't acting properly. Stem cells that produce red blood cells and platelets are located in the red marrow of our bones. And they're kind of like you hear a lot of work on stem cell research. They're kind of like still waiting to become what they're going to become. And so there's a lot of hope with them that we can use stem cells to make new body parts or new organs or do things to help save lives. And one day, certainly that's hopefully going to be the case. So erythrocytes are red blood cells, right? We have more of them than we have anything else if your body is acting the way that it properly should. And they contain something called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is an iron-containing protein that transports the oxygen. So when you're low in iron, it means that your hemoglobin isn't acting properly. Your red blood cells are not acting properly. And so you can get more iron by either taking supplements in vitamins or by consuming more food that's high in iron. Iron's a really, really important part of the diet. So if you're a vegetarian or you avoid red meat or other things that are high in iron, you want to pick it up in other things. Like I believe broccoli has it, spinach probably has it, but things that are high in iron are going to help you feel a lot more energy. when you have low iron content, you're not getting enough oxygen to the places that you should, and so you're usually a little bit more exhausted. Each molecule of hemoglobin binds up to 4 molecules of oxygen. Sickle cell is a disease where hemoglobin is abnormal and it kind of clumps together and it causes the red blood cells to form a shape that isn't right. And so if you've known anyone that has sickle cell anemia or you have it yourself, you know that because you don't have iron acting properly, it's a very debilitating disease because you're extremely tired and extremely worn out most of the time. And it's extremely painful also. So our erythrocytes are only in our body for about 120 days before they're replaced by themselves. So they get used really tough and then they get replaced. And so if you lose a whole lot of blood, it could take up to 3 months before your body can make up for it, which is why blood transfusions sometimes are extremely vital to survival if you have lost a lot of blood. This feedback mechanism is sensitive to oxygen levels in the blood, and it controls the erythrocyte production. Leukocytes are white blood cells, and there's 5 different types of leukocytes, and their job is defense. So they get rid of oxygen, they get rid of junk that's in your body, they respond, they form an immune response against foreign subjects, and they're found both inside and outside of the circulatory system. Platelets are just fragments of cells that function in blood clotting. And so what happens is coagulation is the formation of a solid clot from liquid blood, and a cascade of complex reactions forms this blood clot to happen. A blood clot formed within a blood vessel is called a thrombus, and it can block blood flow. So when it's not acting properly, you get a thrombus, and that's when you basically get a clog, right? And it can kick out, and it can throw a clot into the lungs, which is detrimental. It can throw a clot into the brain. So a thrombus is not a good thing to have within a blood vessel. Cardiovascular disease is that which is a disorder of the heart and or of the blood vessels, and it's probably the #1 killer of anything. And so you hear a lot about, saving your heart and making sure that your heart is healthy, because we simply cannot live if we don't have a functioning heart. You can live for a long period of time without a functioning kidney, or even a portion of a functioning kidney, or even a portion of a non-functioning liver. But without your heart functioning properly, you're just simply not going to be able to survive. So the main types of cardiovascular disease would be heart attacks, stroke, atherosclerosis, and that's where you have hardening of the arteries because of fatty deposits. Too much cholesterol is usually a key player in that, bad diet, that kind of thing. LDL, low density lipoprotein. So we have LDL and we have HDL, and they're kind of 2 different types of cholesterol. So LDL delivers cholesterol cells for membrane production, and HDL scavenges excessive cholesterol for return to the liver. So if you have high LDL to HDL ratio, your risk for heart attack is going to increase. And so HDL is kind of like shrimp are really high in cholesterol, but they're usually high in good cholesterol, they say. There's a picture of that. So heart attack is the death of the cardiac muscle, and so it doesn't work properly like it should. Stroke is death of the nervous tissue in the brain, and it's usually a rupture or a blockage of the arteries. So high LDL to HDL ratio increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. The proportion of LDL relative to HDL is increased by smoking and consumption of trans fats, and decreased by exercise. So if you smoke, you consume things that have a lot of cholesterol and a lot of fat in them, your LDL is going to be pretty high. You can decrease that if you've lived a life like this by starting to exercise a little bit better. And then there's drugs that you can take that can reduce LDL and reduce the risk of heart attack to try to, reduce your cholesterol levels. Inflammation plays a role in that hardening of the arteries. And so you hear about people taking a baby aspirin to try to reduce the risk of stroke. And that's because it reduces the inflammation within the blood vessels. And so there's often a misconception that there's like fat that's built up within the arteries and you can just kind of go in there and rotor it out, right? But really it's inflammation of the actual vessel that causes that hardening and the smaller pathway for the blood to go. Hypertension is high blood pressure, and that also contributes to a risk of heart attack and stroke. And you can reduce high blood pressure. Sometimes it's by dietary changes, exercise, but some people it's hereditary, and so medication is the only way to reduce that. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how the blood moves, but what is this? How does the gas exchange actually happen? So gas exchange is the uptake of oxygen from the environment and the discharge of CO2, right? Because that's what we don't want. Partial pressure is the pressure exerted by a particular gas in a mixture of gases. For example, in the atmosphere, it's only 21% oxygen by volume. So the partial pressure is 0.21 times the atmospheric pressure. I don't think that I really care that you know partial pressure that much, so I'm going to go ahead and skip through that a little bit. What we do know is that the air has plenty of oxygen for us, and so breathing is pretty easy for us to get it in as long as everything's working properly. But there's also quite a bit less oxygen available in water than air, and that's why we can't survive under the water. So obtaining oxygen from the water requires a lot of energy expenditure than air breathing. So aquatic animals have to have a variety of adaptations so that they're able to improve their gas exchange a lot more efficiently. When we have gas exchange across respiratory surfaces, this is taken place by diffusion. It's just moving across membranes without any input of energy to make it happen. Sometimes it's facilitated, but for the most part, it's not. So respiratory surfaces tend to be large and thin and always moist. So if you think about a frog, has always kind of a slimy body, that allows for that diffusion to take place a little bit better. They also will have, so adaptations to the skin always being kind of wet. Gills, trachea, lungs, those are all adaptations to allow us to breathe a little bit better. Gills are outfoldings of the body that look like little slits in the body, right? And the purpose of gills is to create a large surface area for gas exchange. So although it may not take up a whole lot of space, it's folded many times, and so there's more area for that diffusion to take place under the water. So gills having the high surface area allows the fish to breathe without a huge exertion of energy. Ventilation is the movement of the respiratory medium over the respiratory surface. So those gills will also kind of pump the water over the gills so that they can come in contact with more oxygen. Ventilation maintains the necessary partial pressure gradients of oxygen and CO2 across the gills. And aquatic animals move through the water or move water over their gills for ventilation. They never stop moving, and one of the reasons being is they would stop breathing if they didn't. So fish also use this counter current exchange system. So blood flows in the opposite direction to the water, passing over the gills. And so the blood is always less saturated with water with oxygen, when it meets the water so that it can gain more oxygen that way. So there you can see in that image how the gills are just many folds so that it has a lot more surface area to pick up oxygen. Tracheal systems are what insects have, and so they don't have a closed breathing system like we do, and they don't have a closed circulatory system. Instead, what they actually have is holes in the side of their body called spiracles, and instead of breathing through their mouth, they breathe through holes in the side of their body, and air comes in through those holes, and they go into these little things called trachea. Trachea is okay, let's see. So here's your spiracle right here. So this is the outside of the insect's body. It is connected to a trachea, which will branch off into these smaller tracheoles, and those tracheoles will then go directly to the muscle or wherever the oxygen is needed. So it's like it's a very direct way of receiving energy, of receiving oxygen. However, we, along with other animals, have these things called lungs. And so lungs are these, well, we know the shape of what our lungs are, but in the inside, they have a lot of surface area. They fold in many different times, function function of that is to increase gas exchange. And the circulatory system transports gases between the lungs and the rest of the body. So blood leaving the heart, right, goes to the lungs and picks up oxygen. So some of the interesting things about the way things work for humans, when we inhale air through our nose, we kind of warm it and humidify it. And the hairs within our nose will also pick up bad things that we shouldn't necessarily be breathing in. So it's better for us to breathe through our nose a lot of times than it is through our mouth. Even though you have mucus and things that will pick it up in your mouth, your nose is better at kind of filtering things in. We also have this thing called a pharynx. So when we swallow, we move our larynx up and we close our windpipe basically. So you can't, when you choke on your own food, you inhaled your food into your lungs and you cough it back up again. And so our body is adapted so that while air and oxygen comes in one tube, it can't all go down into the same spot. From the larynx, air passes to the trachea and then to this thing called a bronchi and then to bronchioles, which is then within our lungs. And also there's cilia and mucus that line the air ducts to help move things around. So gas exchange actually takes place in the alveoli, which are little air sacs at the tip of the bronchioles. And let's get, I think there's a picture of it here.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous.
That one's a little bit too long. So if you go on to the resources, you can watch these videos. So Bioflix gas exchange, this is a great one to watch. Okay, here we go. So air comes in, and here's the alveoli, which is where gas exchange actually happens. And they are just coated with these capillaries, so they can facilitate that gas exchange. Okay. I'm going to stop this last little section here and we will pick it up a little bit later. So this way, at least it gets you